tonight. I know it's very cold and very tundrous out there, so we appreciate you coming out tonight. Our speaker is Chris Stockdale. He's a third-year medical student over at Stritch. So he's here to sort of share his experiences with you and offer any advice he can on the whole med school process, because I know a lot of us are looming towards that deadline soon. So without further ado, Chris Stockdale.
So I'm going to today talk about getting into medical school. I guess I'm by no means an expert, other than I've done it, I guess. That's really the only thing I think qualifies me, really. But I'm going to start with that, some disclaimers. So there's one. I'm not like some kind of expert on it. What I say isn't like the gospel truth. However, I have a lot of friends that have gone to med school, obviously, and I think I have some good advice, maybe some things that I learned along the way too. Another thing is I'm not really going to talk about osteopathic schools because I just don't know enough about them to be any kind of expert, so DO schools at all. So I really can't help much with that. I haven't really looked at that much. So just this is all mostly for allopathic, but obviously I think there's a lot of overlap. So if you're leaning towards DO schools or osteopathic, it's still probably good advice. If you could get into allopathic, you could probably get into osteopathic too. They have some other requirements I'm not sure about. So that's that. Also, I'm going to talk a lot about what I did to get in. And you all are going to know people that have gotten in without doing some of these things, or exceptions to the rule, or people that have different ways that they've gotten in. So there's lots of different ways to get into medical school. They don't just want everyone to be exactly the same. But with that being said, there are definitely things you can do to strengthen an application, or things you can do to make yourself a better applicant. So just a little outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about required class or anything. I'm not actually sure how far along most of you are in the process, but that's a boring subject. You can figure out what classes you need to take by just going to like the pre-health website. That's much easier. Or a really personal statement. That's just something you got to take care of on your own eventually. So I'm going to talk a lot about the immediate application, GPA and the MCAT, and then how, on top of that, preparing to be a strong applicant with these things, and then a little bit about the process. So GPA and MCAT, there's really no way to sugarcoat it, and most of you probably already know this. That is the basis of your application. You have to have a certain GPA and MCAT, or a certain range to be a competitive applicant. If you don't have a certain range, it doesn't really matter how much of everything else you do, it's going to be hard to get it. So it's definitely something that's, most schools, that's the first thing they look at when you apply. A lot of schools do have screening methods where they cut off right at a certain GPA or MCAT, or a score of the two combined, some kind of number they've come up with. It's definitely the biggest chunk of an application. And there's not really any way around it. So last year, the overall acceptance rate for medical schools, allopathic medical schools, was under 45%. It's obviously still really competitive, and it's getting more competitive every year. They're not actually adding many more spots, and some schools are actually shrinking. But there's more applicants every year. So for instance, I know last year Loyola got over 10,000 applicants, and there's like 160 spots. So it's definitely a competitive field still to get into. But that being said, there's a lot of things you can do to make sure that it's not a crapshoot. There are definitely certain things you can do to make sure you can get in. So a lot of times when people ask me about getting into medical school, they want to know, like, do I have a chance? Is my GPA and MCAT good? And like, the awesome thing about the American Association of Medical Colleges is they just release all that information. So it's not a guessing game. There's no guessing game if you're, like, what your chances are. So this is just the odds. I'm not going to talk about this other than to set it up for what I really want to talk about. But you can look, for instance, if someone has a 3.8 to 4.0 and a 45, 91% of them get into medical school. But still, obviously it's not everything because 10% didn't get in. So there's definitely other things going on. And 2% of people with a 5 to 14 on the, I don't even know, I mean, 2% got in somehow with a 5 to 14 on the MCAT, which is impressive, honestly. So it's definitely still possible. There's obviously other things at play here. And this website, you can just Google search AAMC medical school applicant stats. They break it down by race, by what state you're from, by what schools you want to go to. It's really cool. So they're really upfront about statistics of what it takes to get in grade-wise. So I'm not going to talk about it too much other than some things that aren't really in stats, and that's things that schools look for sure when you're applying. With your GPA, obviously at a certain point your GPA starts kind of getting set. You can't really do much to it. So that's something to, it's obviously difficult to change it after a while. But one thing they like to see, I know for sure, schools like a full workload. If you're taking a light load every semester, unless you're working full-time or taking care of a family member or something, there needs to be an explanation if you're not full-time, because they'll be afraid you won't be able to handle a full load in medical school. So if you're doing like 2 classes a semester every like 10 years and you're not working full-time, they don't have to see that. That's an exaggeration, obviously. But if you take time off Just have a reason for it, just an explanation. It's not hard, but just be able to say why. Obviously, they expect you to take summers off. That's fine. If you go year-round, that's fine too, but they don't really care. And then a lot of people are worried about withdrawals and incompletes when I talk to them. They definitely do look at withdrawals and incompletes, but if there's an explanation for it, again, that's fine. I had a friend in undergrad who, his dad had a stroke, so he withdrew from a couple classes because he was, you know, obviously changed his life. And that's totally acceptable. They know there's reasons, things happen, life gets hard sometimes. But if there's like a consistent pattern of always withdrawing from organic chemistry, for instance, they don't have to see that. And another thing is with grade trend, sometimes, like my GPA was about average for applying to medical school, but I had a really bad freshman year, to be honest, just like really bad, like well below a 3.0. I was really nervous it would hold me back, but I did really well after that, and all the medical schools didn't even care because I had an upward trend. They saw, oh, you learned from your mistake, you had a bad year, but you know, you overcame it. So they really like an upward trend more than necessarily where you end up, as long as you end up above a certain cutoff. So it's not so cut in stone, like this is a certain GPA. And then something to know I didn't really fully realize when I was first applying is they will separate out your science classes and have a separate GPA for that. So it's biology, it's BCPM, so it's biology, all your chemistry classes, your physics classes, and your math classes. And they choose which ones are which. You kind of submit them and they say, this is math, this is not, this is science, this isn't. You don't really get to choose. Like I had an evolution class that didn't count as biology somehow. I wasn't sure how. It was a shame because it would have helped my GPA, but they dropped that out, and then they threw in a computer science class, which I wish they wouldn't have, as math. So, which brings me to my next point, repeating classes. That computer science class I got a D in my freshman year. It was really bad. And a lot of kids in my college, I don't know Loyola's policy, but my college, I went to school at BYU in Utah, and there was a policy that on your transcript it would look like it replaced your grade if you repeated a class. So a lot of kids were under the idea that if you repeat a class, it's like it never happened. But that's, for medical schools at least, allopathic, they don't really care if you repeat the class. If you repeat it, they'll take both grades. So let's say you get a C and then you repeat it and get an A, you basically have a C and an A still. You don't have one A, or I mean you basically have two Bs is what you have, because they just take them both equally. So I would suggest only repeating classes if you don't understand the material and you need it for the future, or if you get a C minus, because otherwise, I mean, I never retook that D class because, I mean, I got below a C minus, but it's not a pre-med class, so they don't really care. Because I thought I'd probably do worse the next time, so I didn't want to repeat that one. It's my worst grade ever, and I didn't want another one. So that's all I'm really going to say about the GPA, because most of your GPAs, if you're far along, are pretty much where they're going to be. You're not going to really change it much, obviously. But the one thing that pretty much everybody can change is the MCAT. So MCAT is, I've noticed some people don't take it very seriously, some people do. I would honestly say it's equally weighted with most schools with your GPA. So that's a good thing. So it shouldn't be scary, it should be an opportunity. I spent a lot of time on the MCAT, and I was really glad I did. It really paid off. It's definitely a beatable test. It's kind of a scary test, but it's definitely beatable with time and effort. There's a lot of talk about people not doing prep courses. I would just absolutely suggest a prep course of some kind. I don't really have a specific one. I did Kaplan. I did it for, not so much for the classes. You know the material, all the materials in the classes you take, pre-med classes. So you're going to learn the material eventually anyways. It's the resources they give you, the practice tests, all the practice tests that they give you when you pay for it, that's worth it. Honestly, a lot of people they look at the MCAT as if it's not that big of a deal. It's not the ACT or the SAT, it is half of your application. Honestly, it's the other half, the GPA is the main half. This is equally weighted at most schools, and it can really do someone a lot of good if you have a great MCAT score, or at least a good MCAT score, and it could also really sink an application quicker than anything else. And the reason I'm talking about it more is because it's something everyone can still do. So that's kind of the nice thing to think about. So I would look at the MCAT as an opportunity, not necessarily a bad thing. It's an opportunity to prove yourself to the schools. Obviously, if you're weaker on GPA, the MCAT even becomes more important then, because you can prove you can do it. And it's the great equalizer between schools too. So if someone coming in from a school maybe with great inflation, they get a poor MCAT, it looks poorly on them. But if you come in with a good MCAT, they know, okay, this person knows their stuff, they can do it. Which isn't necessarily true, right? It just means you might just be a good test taker. It's not exactly fair, but that's the way it works. And honestly, medicine is full of standardized tests, so they like standardized test takers anyways. So what I did, just to tell you what I did to study for it, I took 6 months actually to study for the MCAT, almost 7. I didn't take time off from school. What I did is I just did, the first couple months I did 15 hours a week studying for it. And then the last 4 months I bumped it up to 20 hours a week. I just make sure I logged my 20 hours every week and focused on my weaknesses. Whatever, I did a practice test just about every other week. I ended up doing close to 16 practice tests. I think it was 15 or 16, which is a lot. But I would honestly say do any test you can get your hands on, because there's only so many ways they can ask you questions on the test. And honestly, it felt like I was taking a practice test when I took the real one. I wasn't stressed because I'd taken so many. I just flew through it like it was just like a practice test to me. It was really nice to do that. So honestly, I would suggest a prep course. And a lot of people say they cost a lot of money, but there is some financial aid available. One of my friends got financial aid for them through the programs themselves. Like Kaplan, I know, does financial aid. And the other thing I would think about is it's like $2,000, right? But your tuition's more than that. And this is honestly worth just as much as your GPA. So it's just as much if you want to become a doctor, an integral part of your education. It's worth it. It's definitely worth the money. And I'm not selling for them because I don't get anything from that. But honestly, I would do some kind of prep course. So those are, this is my wife, by the way. She went through the whole process.
Yeah, so I was in this. When he says he was studying 20 hours a week, he was not on Facebook, not on his cell phone. He was legitimately locked in the back room 20 hours at the computer taking practice tests. Like, there was no screwing around during that time. So, you gotta say.
That's true.
It was serious.
It's a really, I know it sounds like I'm going on strong on the MCAT, but honestly, it not only can it do you a lot of good getting in, it can get you scholarships, it can get you lots of opportunities that are definitely worth putting the time in. The MCAT's the great equalizer, they really like it.
So I'll also add, for those of you planning on going to graduate school, GRE, yeah, maybe not as big of a deal as, like, it's maybe not 50% of the application, but it can make up for deficiencies in GPA as well. So
yeah, Laura did the GRE, so she did it real quick, right? So that's obviously the biggest part of your application are those two things, but they're not really fun to talk about. And honestly, it's just study. I mean, there's nothing to say other than study. But when we looked at that chart, 10% of people with a almost perfect MCAT and almost perfect GPA still didn't get it, and 2% of people with horrible MCAT and it's still a good GPA got in. So there's obviously more at play than just your MCAT and GPA. So that's actually what I'm going to talk about now, because this is the stuff I think a lot of people don't really think about when applying to medical school, and it's really important still to be part of that percentage that's accepted every year. So one thing that medical schools really like to see is physician shadowing. So I actually have known some people that have got in with very little physician shadowing, like 4 hours before. But most people I know have a substantial amount of physician shadowing before they apply to medical school. And the reason for that is your undergraduate education is nothing like being a doctor. In fact, there's nothing you do that is. And you're investing yourself in this program that it's 4 years of medical school and then at least 3 years of residency. You're talking a couple $100,000 to pay tuition. They want to know you actually know what you're getting into. Is basically what it comes down to. They want to know you're not just thinking, oh, I watch ER, it's cool. Because that's their concern, is that people just think it's cool to be a doctor. They want to know that you know it's long hours, that you know it's going to be a long road, that it's going to be expensive, and that you find it rewarding. So they want you to have shadowed it. So I'm not going to talk about it too much because shadowing is pretty much just following a doctor around. But I would definitely take the time. I would suggest 50 to 100 hours. These numbers I've come up with, I didn't just come up with out of the air. Actually, I talked to my undergrad's pre-med advising program. I don't know Loyola very well, so I didn't talk to theirs. But this is what they suggest. It's not required. Very few schools will require a set number of shadowing hours. There's a couple, like University of Utah, for instance, requires 40 hours. There are some that have, Stanford requires a certain amount, or they used to. Some schools will, but most, they just need to see it. They need to know that you know what you're getting into. So it's kind of hard to do shadowing sometimes. I would give a suggestion. If you have a family friend that's a doctor, ask them. If you have a family member that's a doctor, ask them. And then the nice thing from there is as soon as you know one person, you can branch out from there. You say, well, how about some of your colleagues I can shadow? I would suggest, just not because medical schools care, but for your own ease, I would try to stick with a few doctors because it's a lot easier to report on your application eventually. These things are all things you do to build up your application, but when you're actually filling out that application, it's nice to not have to list like 20 doctors and how many hours was I with that one, and what did I do there, what did I learn? It's easier just to put, I was with this guy for 40 hours, and this is what I learned.
Would you say physician shadowing is just as important as volunteering at a hospital, or more?
I think they're pretty equal, yeah. Which I'll talk about volunteering too. if you haven't volunteered, well, I'll talk about this in a second. Physician shadowing can become more important if you haven't spent time with patients anyways. It's like a balancing act. You need a little bit of everything, but this would be more important if you don't spend time, or you don't spend time in the medical field anyways, right? Less important if you're an EMT or something, you still need to do it, but obviously your patient contact is higher, so it might drop a little bit. It just depends. But I think it's really important, not just for your application, but you want to know what you're getting into, so I would definitely shadow. I don't know if Loyola has a program. My school had a program where it set us up with people to shadow, which was cool. Gave us like 80 hours of shadowing between 2 doctors. Look into that, see if they have one. I'm not sure if they do. There's just different ways to try to find it. Easiest way is it's family, friends. If you have to cold call, it really sucks and it's not fun, but some doctors are pretty understanding and they know that you need to shadow, especially at academic centers, because they know the deal. The only problem with academic centers is you're going to be behind residents and medical students and PA students, which kind of sucks because they're the lowest on their interest level. And in fact, I've had a couple times this year where they've had undergraduates just shadow me, which would really suck as an experience for an undergraduate student, to be honest with you. So community doctors are sometimes better because they don't have anyone with them. So they may not be used to it, which is sometimes a good thing, because then they don't just relegate you to the medical student. Talking about volunteering, service. Service is definitely a requirement for medical school. I wouldn't say you need 200 hours. I would say 200 hours is ideal plus. The more you have, you cannot have too much service. They just want as much service as you can give them. It needs to be a consistent track record of service too, not just, oh, I'm applying to medical school, so I did 4 months real quick of like serious service. That's good, and it probably would be enough to get by, but they really like lots of service. Physicians definitely see themselves as people who are giving of their time. Obviously, physicians are well compensated, so you can debate that all you want, but it's definitely seen within the medical profession as a serviceable profession. So they want to know that you're giving, which means they really look for service. I don't know anybody that's gotten to medical school without service, to be honest, of some kind. It's essential. It doesn't have to be medically related. Medically related, obviously, you can kill multiple birds with one stone, but it doesn't need to be. I did lots of random stuff. I did some service. I did work at a hospital volunteering 4 hours a week for a couple years. But I also worked at Lincoln Park Zoo for a while, like gardening, and they like that too. In fact, they probably like that. They talked about it more on my interviews. They really thought it was fun. So it's kind of nice to have something to talk about too. So service, absolutely important. This research is this is not something that's required by any means, but it's definitely something that can set you apart from other students. This is somewhere where you can take a step well above the other applicants. It's not required. I would recommend a year of it. It doesn't actually have to be medical. It needs to be using the scientific theory. I mean, if you're not doing science, like if you're doing literature research where you're reading books, I don't know if they would like that as much. But if it's using scientific method, then you know how to use it, and that's what they want to see, that you know how to use the scientific method. If it is medical, it kind of can help, again, kill multiple birds with one stone, as we'll get into in a second. But mine wasn't. I did research for 3 years in the lab on osteoarthritis, so it sounds medical, but I actually was with mice. So it's kind of medical, but it was really more bench research with mice. It wasn't clinical. It doesn't actually really matter what your job is in the lab either. They know that you're an undergraduate student. Some students will end up having big jobs in the lab where they're a lab coordinator of some kind or have really important jobs. In some schools and some labs in particular, they might just let you wash dishes all the time, which is not ideal, but they want to know that you're involved in research. They want to know that you've gone beyond the classroom. So the thing that can really set you apart, which is a lot of work, obviously, requires being important in the lab, actually like doing things in the lab, is a publication is ideal. I mean, if you can get a publication, they love to see publications, obviously. But something that most students can do, publications is a lot harder to perform, especially as an undergraduate, depending on how much the professor lets you get involved. But posters are something undergraduate students can do pretty easily, actually. Especially with Loyola, I know St. Albert's Day out at Loyola is open to all undergraduate students too. Poster presentations look good on an application. It shows that you actually have an interest in the research. One caveat about research is if you put it on your application, know what you're doing in your research. If you show up for an interview and they say, well, tell me about your research, and you're like, oh, I don't know, I just wash dishes, then it just undid all your research. They don't care now, you know? You obviously weren't invested in it. You have to be invested in it. Anyway, definitely I would recommend a year. I did 3 years. It was really, people really like to see it. If you have no interest in research, you don't have to lie though. So. patient exposure is actually required, I know, for Loyola to apply from Loyola as an undergrad because you have to get the committee letter. So all medical schools are going to want to see it too. This is when I was talking about killing two birds with one stone. If you're volunteering in a hospital, you're getting patient exposure, so you may not need as many hours of physician shadowing, although you're going to need some, for sure. But not as many as someone who's not doing any volunteering in a hospital or not working as an EMT or something, or a phlebotomist. There's lots of different jobs you can do. But they want to know that you've had exposure to patients and that you want to work with patients. They want to know that you can work with patients. So what I did actually, I worked as a phlebotomist also for a few months. It was like 6 months when I took a break from school for a while. Long story, but and they like to see that you have patient exposure. It doesn't have to be EMT or anything, that doesn't hurt. And then on top of all this, they want to know that you're well-rounded. So even though you're spending all your time doing research, volunteering, shadowing doctors, working part-time job on the side, studying for the MCAT, they want you doing sports, clubs, traveling, and doing all sorts of fun stuff. Because they don't want robots. So this is not hard. Just keep track of what you do, honestly. Like, I wouldn't say you have to go above and beyond and do crazy things. For instance, I was filling out my application, I realized I played intramural soccer every year. Just put it on the application, they like seeing it. Shows you're involved in other things besides just medical school. That's not your whole life. You've got a life beyond it. If you do a travel abroad, definitely put it in. If you do clubs, it's not something you necessarily need to like aim for, but just keep track of what you're doing. Some things I would suggest not putting on the application that people do is video games. Video games, they don't want to see it, they don't care. We all like video games. They don't want to see it. I've heard people do it, but you have to know your audience. You're not giving the application to another student. It's going to some 65-year-old doctor who thinks video games are a complete waste of time. And they're right, but, I mean, I like them too, but they're right, and they're not going to want to see that. So unless you have some notable achievement like you actually programmed it, you probably don't really care about that. Just a slight caveat there. I've seen people do it. And one of the other things they want to see is leadership. So again, this is one of the things you can knock off with other things. They want to know that you have some kind of leadership ability, because physicians are seen as the leaders in the healthcare field in terms of you will have a team of people that will be working under you in the hospital. Obviously there's people over you too, but you'll have nurses working with you, you'll have PAs. If you're in an academic center, you'll have residents and medical students. And they want to know that you're going to be able to lead them and be a leader. So you don't have to be student body president or anything. It doesn't need to be something that big. But if you have an opportunity for leadership, definitely, like you're in a club and you could be a leader, they like to see that. They like to see that you have leadership abilities. It's pretty straightforward. I'd definitely knock it out with one of the other ones. If you're, let's say you're volunteering, or you could set up volunteering. That's leadership right there. You know, you set up some kind of volunteer organization or some kind of program to do things. Kill two birds with one stone right there. And then this isn't really something that, all these things I've talked about so far have been things you can do all the way along, and this seems like something just for the application. But rec letters actually are a little more work than just for the application. I actually think they're one of the things people overlook a lot. At Loyola, it's a committee letter, so I'll say a couple things about the committee letter. Schools, if your school has a committee letter available, don't go around it. Use the committee letter. It's a bad mark to not use the committee letter. They don't like seeing not using the committee letter. Some people get in without it. Definitely happens, but if you can use the committee letter, I would definitely use it. Which means, I looked up the website, there's all these certain dates you have to keep. It looks kind of tricky. You have to have 50 hours of exposure. Level 3.0 honestly just looks like a way for them to control so their stats look better. Because it does, because you can't apply with less than a 3.0 then. But schools, if you have a committee letter, you have to explain why you're not using it. So I would use the committee letter. The committee letter here at Loyola, that's the website there. No one's going to write that down. You can just look on the website. But 3 letters of evaluation that they ask for you to have. One's clinical, one's a Loyola faculty. I would suggest a science faculty, since that's going to be your first 2 years. And the reason I say these take a lot of work is you don't want a letter going that says, this student took my class, it was 4 credits, they got this grade. Like, that's a worthless letter. They can look at your transcript to get that. What they want to see is this student has these attributes, and these are things that we know you're looking for, and this student has them. He or she is really good at problem solving. So to do that, you have to get to know the faculty and get to know the clinician that's writing you a letter. It takes work. So for instance, for mine, I got one from an organic chemistry professor because I needed a science one. I had a research one, which is kind of science, but he was really my research mentor. So I went to my organic chemistry's professor's office hours once a week and got to know him. I went there, I had questions. Sometimes I made up questions to go talk to him, which had he known that, maybe it would have been annoying, so they make sure they're good questions. But I wanted him, so when I came in and asked him for my letter, he said, oh, okay, Chris, I'll write you one, instead of, oh, let me write down your name. What's your name? What class did you take for me? Because that's worthless then. Like that's just a transcript then. That's not very helpful. So that's why I put it here, because it takes work to get a good rec letter. I took multiple classes from one professor to get a letter from him, because I knew that he would know who I was then. I don't think you have to do that, but if you want a rec letter that doesn't sound like everybody else's, then they should know who you are. And frankly, they should just, yeah, if you want a good letter, I would definitely make sure they know who you are. So I think those are the steps to build on top of your GPA and MCAT. That's to get that extra percentage to make sure you get in. The application process itself is actually, it sounds weird, but it's kind of fun. Once you get going, if you feel like you have a pretty good shot, I think it's actually a pretty enjoyable process. It's a lot of work. One thing I cannot stress enough, and some people don't sell this very much, is apply early. Like as soon as it opens. Honestly, a lot of people wait. I just think that's a mistake. I'll talk about that again because it's a big thing for me. Some other application tips, people I know that didn't get in chose only Ivy Leagues, which is just not a good choice, even if you're a great applicant. If you want to go to medical, if you want to go to an Ivy League medical school only, sure, that's a fine choice. But if you want to go to medical school, be real, put some other schools on there too, you know. And I would shoot for one school. A lot of people shoot for just like, oh, I just want to get into one school. But you want as many acceptances as possible. There's no reason you should limit yourself. Part of that is it can play a role later on when you're trying to get financial aid. Schools, they see how many schools you've been into and they see what other ones, how much their tuition is. They might be willing to match and give you a scholarship. People say there aren't scholarships in medical school. There's actually a lot of scholarships in medical school. Definitely something worth, the more acceptances you have, that's leverage. It's good stuff to have. So this is something I'd suggest for everybody. It's the MSTAR, it's the Medical School Admissions Requirement Book. It's about 20 bucks online. This is awesome. This thing is every medical school in the United States, every MD medical school. I think the DO schools have one too, but again, I don't know enough about it to say much. It goes through every medical school. It will tell you how many spots they have, what their average MCAT is, what's their average GPA, what kind of things they look for in a student. Some of them are more informative than others, but it tells you when their application, their last date for application is. Ignore that because you want to go early. If you're applying at that date, it's pretty late. November 1st is absurdly late, actually. It tells you how much the tuition is. It tells you all sorts of things like that, what kind of service they do, if there's a research project you have to do before you graduate. It's an awesome resource. They sell a paper one too. I bought the paper one because I like paper still, and I went through and marked every school I was interested in first. And it was like, up 160 schools or something, I had like 100 marks. And then I went through and I was like, all right, that's ridiculous. Take a bunch out, you know. Talk to people that you care about, which ones you want to go to. It's an awesome resource, definitely worth investing in so you know which schools are in your range. Which brings me to choosing schools. A lot of people, I think, make the mistake of choosing schools poorly. Definitely have some reach schools. There's no reason you shouldn't reach. But I would definitely pick most of your schools within your range. They'll tell you right there what their MCAT and GPA is, and you just know if you're in their range. If you're too high for a school, they might think you're not going to pick them. They might not even interview. If you're too low, well, that one's more obvious. But doesn't mean you can't try. And then have some safety schools. Again, safety schools and medical schools is kind of a weird term. When only 44% of people are accepted, there's not really such thing. But if you're above the average of a few schools, it's not a bad thing to throw them a bone and see if you can get in. In terms of number of schools, it's totally up to you. I applied to 26, way too many, honestly. I ended up not finishing the application for 9 of them, so I just wasted money on the first half of the application on 9 of them because I was crazy. I don't know what I was doing. But I would suggest more than 10. It's hard to get into medical school, and you know, if you shoot with a shotgun, you're more likely to hit something. And some things to keep in mind with schools, I had a really strong application, to be honest. I only got interviewed at schools that I had a connection with in some way. Either my state school, I don't actually have a state school, so that's kind of weird, but schools that had to deal with my state, because we didn't have a state school, I got interviews at them. Schools that I had family members that had gone to, not just medical school, but master's or undergraduate or something, those schools interviewed me. Schools in cities where I lived interviewed me, but like random schools in New York, even if I was way better than their average, didn't even hear a peep from them. So there's so many applicants that if they're looking through that pile and you have some kind of connection, they're like, okay, well, let's take a look at this person. You will get random ones, that does happen, but honestly, I didn't. So it's possible, I know people do, but if you have a connection to the school, it definitely helps. And the last point on this slide is only apply to schools you actually go to. There are a lot of times people are like, oh, I got one application, but I don't like that school, I'm going to wait till next year. You really can't do that. If you have an MD acceptance, you pretty much have to take it. Schools don't like it if the next year you're like, oh, I turned down one last year. Because they think you're going to turn them down again. Why would they take you? So only apply to schools you're actually willing to go to. Because otherwise, why'd you throw an application even? It's a waste of your money, and you might end up going there anyways, which would really suck if you don't want to go there. So only apply to schools you actually want. And honestly, I would apply that to DO. If you do DO as a backup plan, MD schools also don't like seeing that you turn down a DO school if that was your only acceptance the year before. So if you're like, oh, you know, I haven't gotten to a couple DO schools, I want to do MD next year, I'll just wait. They really don't like seeing that either. So if you're going to apply DO, you kind of have to be willing to go there. People will get in again the next year, it does happen, but I generally don't think of myself as the exception. I think of myself as the rule. And the rule is, if you've been accepted, they don't like that if you turn it down. One other thing that is cool, a good idea, I think, is schools where your undergraduate students from your school have gone, so where Loyola students have gone before. Because they know then that those students, oh, they've had good experiences. Let's take this student, the last like 5 were good. Maybe we'll get another good one. So that's something definitely to keep in mind. For instance, my school, for some reason, gets like 15 students a year into Ohio State. I have no idea why. The connection started sometime years back, and now every year, every BYU student applies to Ohio State. And honestly, 15 get in every year. And it doesn't make any sense. It's a long ways away. There's no relationship there. But now that it's like this funnel that's been created, I applied there, I got in there, you know, because that's how it works. Someone had already cleared the way before. They've had so many good experiences, they just keep doing it. So I know the pre-health office has a list of schools Loyola students have gone to. It's just a good list to look over and see if any of those interest you as well. Finally, the application. Again, I would honestly say as early as possible. It opens June 3rd this year. What I did is I took the MCAT in May, which I would highly suggest taking the MCAT as early as you're ready for it. It opens May 1st, and you can start working on your application, and I submitted it day 1. Schools have rolling admissions, which means the longer you wait, the less spots there are available for them. It's kind of a big deal. A lot of people will get in late, you'll hear people doing that, but again, why would you want to limit your chances? I had a friend who had a 38 MCAT, awesome GPA. He applied like the last day. He got into one school. He would have probably gotten a scholarship somewhere. He's happy, but I mean, it would have been nice if he had a little less debt, you know? So getting more acceptances is definitely applying early helps do that. And something with secondaries to keep in mind. Personal statement. The only thing I'm ever going to say about it is just have lots of people read it. Read online, have a new personal statement. I'm really not good at writing, so I can't really give you any tips. In terms of secondaries, schools will send you a secondary application. I don't know if everyone knows this already, after your primary. Something to keep in mind with those is a lot of people think that means that they want you, and I'm not trying to be a downer, but they want your application and they want your money maybe. They may not necessarily, they send them to everybody, most schools do, regardless of your stats. Some schools will, Loyola screens for instance, they'll actually screen out students. So if Loyola sends you one, they have interest. But most schools will just spam these to every student that applies. Send us your $100, and then the next day you get a rejection. They didn't read it really, you know. You're already below their filter. I mean, that happened to me. University of Chicago did that to me. And I got the rejection back like a couple days later, and you know, what did I pay them, $150 to tell me no? Like, so it's something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean, like, you can get excited with secondaries, but just know that most of them are spam to every student that applies. Which sucks. But another thing with secondaries is they're kind of like sending a note to a girl in elementary school or a boy. If you hold them too long, the schools might think you don't have interest, which is really weird. But it's like, I'm serious, it's true. If you hold on to it for 2 weeks, they're thinking, oh, they don't care about us. If they get it back and realize you've held it for 2 weeks, or 2 weeks is probably not too long, but you hold it for a month or two, they think you're not interested anymore. Just like if you pass a note in elementary school, you know. So I would definitely finish them as soon as possible. A lot of them you can, you know, steal some information from other applications you've done and put them in there. But they're tricky. They word them just a little bit differently, so you have to rewrite the whole essay. It's really annoying. It's also really expensive. Secondaries, they're like $100 each. It's crazy. You can apply with AMCAS for financial aid. I didn't get any. I don't know how you can be more poor than I am, but it's really annoying. Lastly, the interview process. Even after you've gotten this far, if you tank the interview, the schools won't take you. My MCAT teacher had like a 44 or something crazy. He got like tons of interviews, and then he'd get in fights with the interviewer. Like, he didn't get anyone. Like, they don't care about him because he fought. He like literally told me he left Ohio State, and the guy was yelling at him. And he's like, oh, I didn't get in. Well, of course he didn't get it. An idiot, you know? So I practice them, and I do know the Loyola Pre-Health Office will set up mock interviews. If you haven't interviewed like that before, practice it. And be ready to answer questions. There's a website, studentdoctor.net, I don't know how many people are aware of it. There's a nice collection of questions that schools typically ask people. You can go on specific schools and see what questions get asked there. But honestly, the two questions you're going to get at every school are, why do you want to be a doctor? Just have an answer ready for that and just be ready to throw it down, because they're going to ask you that straight out the door. And the second one is, why this school? Everyone wants to know those two things, and if you're interviewing in New York, you can't just say it because New York's cool. Like, they don't care about that. Of course New York's cool. Everyone wants it. That's what people do in Chicago. They'll say, because Chicago's cool. They don't care about that. They know that Chicago's cool, but why that school? So have that ready. And the nice thing about that question is you can turn that question around and say, well, why this school? You know, because you need to ask them questions and say, tell me why I should come here. Like, what makes you special? Why do you think you're special? Not in like a rude way, but there must be something that they think they're good at. The other thing is dress the part. I went on an interview with someone who had like jeans in a sports jacket. It doesn't really fly in a med school interview. Wear a suit. Boys and girls wear suits, honestly. Everyone does. You can try other things, but you don't want to be the person that sticks out because of what you're wearing, unless it's awesome. That just doesn't, that's not a good reason to stick out. So it's just some resources. The Loyola Pre-Health office seems like they have it together pretty well. I don't know anything about them, sorry. The MSAR is awesome. I cannot undersell the MSAR. It is a really good resource once you're actually applying. StudentDoctor.net is a double-edged sword. If you haven't checked it out, maybe wait. But if you, honestly, it can be a real downer. I would avoid the forums sometimes. But at the same time, it can be a great resource for interviewing. And I didn't look at it until after I took the MCAT, because people just freak each other out on there. But it is a good resource sometimes. The last thing is AMCAS and AMC have lots of great information about applying, especially the stats for who gets into medical school can really take a load off your mind sometimes, or really freak you out, so maybe don't check it out. Depends on the situation you're in. But I hear a lot of people that think medical school is impossible to get into, and that is blind luck. I don't think it's blind luck. I think a lot of people just don't know how to get in. And the thing is, you need to kind of cover all the bases. If you're weak in one area, you can make up for another area. But there are certain deficiencies you can't make up for. A below 3.0 GPA is going to be really hard to make up for. Obviously it's possible. You'll see 2% of people probably get in with below 3.0. But generally consider yourself the rule and not the exception, which means cover your bases. If you have a deficiency somewhere, try to fix it. If you're deficient on GPA, try to fix it with the MCAT. Definitely make up for it. Or extracurriculars. So that's really all I have to say about it. I don't think it's blind luck. I get kind of annoyed when people tell me it's blind luck, because I worked way too hard for it to be blind luck. And I know everyone that tries to get in does the same thing. And honestly, I think it shows a little bit of not understanding the process. And that's because it's kind of a hidden process that for some reason isn't published anywhere. But if you do all those things, honestly, you can get into more than one school. Like I said, there are resources that schools have available financially. You can even ask. It's kind of crazy. They don't really care. They're fine with you asking for money. I mean, once you're in, don't ask before you're in. That's a great idea. But anyway, that's about all I have to say about it, unless there's any questions at all.